When the heavy iron gates of the federal penitentiary finally opened after 12 long years, I did not call my wife. I did not call my brother. I simply took a cab straight to the Virginia estate I had built from absolutely nothing. I was supposed to serve 20 years for a corporate fraud I never committed, but a newly unsealed digital footprint had just cleared my name. I thought I was coming home to a family that had suffered alongside me, a family that had waited for my return. But as I stood in the hallway of my own home, listening to the clink of ice and whiskey glasses, I heard the two people I loved most in this world laughing. They were laughing about how they had stolen my $50 million company, drained my retirement, and planned to lock me in a nursing home if I ever managed to get out. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just listened. And then I made a decision that would change everything. If you are listening to my story today, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of betrayal you only think happens in movies until it happens in your own living room. The name is Gerald Hargrove. 12 years back, everything I had built was ripped away from me. I founded Hargrove Tech, started it in a garage with nothing but an idea, and watched it grow into something that mattered, something that was mine. At my side, I had Warren, my brother, sharp as anyone I have ever known, running the finances as CFO. And I had Lynette, my wife, my anchor. Or so I thought. Federal agents hit our offices hard 12 years ago. What they pulled out were doctored ledgers and a trail of illegal offshore transfers, every last one stamped with my digital signature. I never put them there. I never touched them. But I could not prove that, not then. So I walked into prison swearing I was innocent, certain that Warren and Lynette would spend every waking hour working to get me out. Instead, I wore through over 4,000 days on a concrete prison cot, kept alive by the idea of coming back to them. That day finally arrived. My freedom came quietly. No cameras, no press conference. A routine dig through an old server turned up the real story behind those signatures. And just like that, the system cut me loose. Someone pressed a brown paper bag containing the clothes I was arrested in into my hands, and I stepped out into the open air. No fanfare, no calls to warn anyone. What I wanted was their faces. I wanted the look on Lynette's face when she saw me standing there, the woman whose letters had dwindled from weekly to nothing, somewhere around year 3. I wanted to wrap my arms around Warren, who kept sending word that he was holding Hargrove Tech together for the day I returned. The cab let me out at the bottom of the long driveway, my Tudor-style Virginia mansion rising at the far end of it. Autumn had settled in. The air had that clean, cold bite to it. The grounds were immaculate just as I had left them. I settled with the driver using nearly the last of my cash and moved toward the heavy oak door. My keys were long gone, confiscated the morning they took me in. But I remembered the fake stone tucked beneath the big porch planter and the spare key buried inside it. I bent down my 70-year-old joints, protesting every inch of the way after a decade on prison beds, and my fingers closed around cold metal, right where I left it. I worked the key into the lock slow and easy. The door gave way without a whisper. Cedar candle warmth and the scent of polished wood washed over me. The house was still, welcoming. I crossed the threshold, brown paper bag in hand. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this is your first time, settle in, because the stories we tell here have a way of staying with you. If you feel moved by what you hear, tap that subscribe button so the next story finds you without you having to go looking. Before we get into it, I want to hear from you. When someone wrongs you deeply, do you believe in speaking up right away? Or do you think there is real power in staying quiet and waiting for the right moment? Drop your answer in the comments. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped and dramatized for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I nearly called out their names, but something stopped me. A heaviness settled deep in my chest. Call it the instinct of a man who spent 12 years reading dangerous rooms. Something was off. I moved quietly down the long hallway toward the back of the house, and that's when I caught its sound leaking from my old study. The door hung slightly ajar, throwing a thin wedge of warm yellow light across the hardwood floor, ice dropping into crystal, that unmistakable clink, and then a voice. Warren. Not strained or weary the way he always described himself in those rare messages he sent me, relaxed, confident, dripping with arrogance. The lawyer just called. Warren said, his voice carrying easily through the gap. "Gerald got his early parole approved today. He is officially a free man." I went completely still. My heart slammed against my ribs. They already knew. They had known before I even set foot in the driveway. My hand came up, ready to push the door open, ready to let them see me. But before my fingers reached the wood, a second voice cut through. Lynette, my wife, the woman whose face had kept me company through thousands of nights staring at a concrete ceiling. "Well, that is incredibly inconvenient," Lynette said. Her voice was ice cold, no relief in it, no warmth, nothing. Just pure, undisguised annoyance. "Did you wire the last $10 million from his retirement fund to the offshore account like we planned?" My hand froze in midair. The air in my lungs turned thick and sharp like breathing through broken glass. I pressed myself close to the gap and listened. "Done," Warren replied, and there was a soft, satisfied chuckle behind the word. "I finished the transfer an hour ago. Every single trace of his liquid assets has been scrubbed, funneled through 3 different shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. That 70-year-old convict has absolutely nothing left to his name. The company is completely in my control, and his personal accounts are empty." I could not breathe. The room felt like it was tilting. My brother, my own blood. The man I had handed my life's work to, without a second thought, talking through the mechanics of how he had gutted me calm, as if reading a weather report. Lynette answered with a dark, mocking laugh I had never once heard from her before. It sent a chill straight through me. "Good," she said, the crystal clinking as she took a sip. "Let him come home. What exactly is he going to do? He's a disgrace, broke old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we toss him in some cheap, rundown nursing home. We say his mind went in prison. Nobody will question it. We hold the power of attorney after all." "Exactly," Warren agreed, touching his glass to hers. "To us, Lynette, to the perfect crime and the perfect life." They were raising a toast, standing in my study, drinking my whiskey, celebrating the wreckage of everything I had ever built. In the span of a few seconds, 12 years of longing and love collapsed into something cold and suffocating, like ash settling on my chest. They had known from the beginning. They had engineered all of it from the beginning. The pain hit me physically sharp and deep, like a blade working its way between my ribs. I wanted to buckle. I wanted to open my throat and scream until there was nothing left. But I did not. Prison had ground one lesson into me until it was bone deep. When wolves surround you, you do not weep. You do not let them see you bleed. You watch. You wait. You build your counterattack in silence. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so enormous it had gone somewhere past anger, past anything I had a name for. As my grip loosened, the brown paper bag slipped from my fingers and clipped a small decorative glass vase on the hallway console table. The vase tipped and shattered across the hardwood floor. The sound cracked through the quiet house like a gunshot. Inside the study, the laughter cut off. The glasses went silent. A heavy, suffocating stillness took over the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Warren's voice had gone tense, the arrogance stripped right out of it. "Probably just the wind," Lynette whispered, though her voice wasn't steady either. I did not run. I did not hide. I slowly dragged my foot through the remaining shards, clearing them aside. Then I stepped directly into the open doorway of the study. Warren and Lynette stood by the fireplace, drinks suspended halfway to their lips. The moment they turned and registered my face, the color fell out of theirs completely. They looked at me the way people look at something that cannot be real. In a sense, they were right. The trusting, naive Gerald Hargrove who walked into that prison 12 years ago was gone. The man in the doorway was someone else entirely. I took in my brother wearing my father's watch. I took in my wife with the diamond necklace I had given her for our anniversary. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for either of them. I stood there, back straight eyes, locked onto theirs, with the flat, cold gaze of a man who has been stripped of everything and is no longer afraid of anything. "Hello, Warren. Hello, Lynette," I said, my voice low and perfectly even. "I hope I'm not interrupting a celebration." They stared at me in rigid, paralyzed horror. The game had shifted beneath their feet, and they had no idea what direction it would move next. For exactly 3 seconds, not one of us moved. I held the doorway, watching the 2 people I had burned through 4,000 nights thinking about. Then their survival instincts kicked in. Lynette moved first. The cold schemer vanished like a switch had been thrown. Her face folded into an expression of overwhelming emotion. She dropped her glass onto the Turkish rug whiskey, splashing across it, and let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. Tears appeared instantly. She crossed the room, fast heels clattering, and flung her arms around my neck, burying her face against my shoulder and sobbing. "Gerald!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, you are finally home." She held me tightly. I felt nothing. Her perfume had turned to poison. A beat later, Warren shook himself free of his paralysis. He set his glass down hard and came at me, seizing my right hand in both of his, the grip fierce and desperate, the grip of a devoted brother. His eyes glistened. "Brother," he choked out. "They didn't warn us. The lawyer only said the parole was approved. We had no idea you'd actually be here today. Look at you. We missed you so much." I stood inside their embrace. 12 years ago, I would have broken down entirely, thanked God, out loud, held them both, and wept. Now, feeling Lynette's manufactured tears soaking into my prison shirt and Warren's treacherous hands wrapped around mine, what moved through me was cold and still and absolute. I let them finish their performance. Then I carefully lifted Lynette's arms from around my neck. I pulled my hand free of Warren's and stepped back. The smile I had forced dissolved. "I missed you too," I said, dangerously calm. "But before we celebrate what 10 million enters what offshore account in Switzerland, en mind Bartverstaan was star." The room went dead. Lynette's sobs caught in her throat. Warren's jaw went rigid. They understood. I had heard every word. I watched their eyes move to each other, a whole silent conversation passing between them in a fraction of a second. I wanted to see them break, confess, beg, but Warren was far too sharp for that. He hadn't run Hargrove Tech's finances for years because he was careless. He was a master of turning disasters inside out. He drew a slow breath and pivoted flawlessly. He did not look like a guilty man. He looked like an exhausted one. He ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled the long, heavy sigh of someone carrying an unbearable weight. "I was hoping we could give you one peaceful night before we had to get into the nightmare we've been living," Warren said with terrifying sincerity. "Gerald, when you were convicted, the federal government did not stop at sending you to prison. The Securities and Exchange Commission came after Hargrove Tech with everything they had. They wanted to liquidate your entire life's work to cover federal fines, seize every asset, every dollar you had ever earned." Lynette stepped forward, dabbing at dry eyes, her voice quivering with righteous indignation. "We were losing everything, Gerald. The board abandoned us entirely. The press painted you as a monster. We had to make a choice, protect your legacy, even if that made us look like the villains." Warren moved closer, his tone urgent and pleading. "I brought in the best defense attorneys I could find, and they were clear the only way to protect the company's capital from federal seizure was to remove it from your name completely. We had to move fast. Lynette and I arranged a legal separation of assets. We established a spousal preservation trust in an offshore jurisdiction somewhere federal agents had no reach. That is the Swiss account you overheard." He pressed a hand firmly onto my shoulder, his face arranged into the very picture of brotherly devotion. "We moved every liquid asset, including that final 10 million from your retirement fund, into that trust today because the closing audit was upon us. Had we left anything in your name, the government would have seized it the instant you walked through those prison gates. We took the villain's role. We let the world believe we had turned our backs on you all to protect what you built." Lynette drifted to my other side and laid her hand gently against my chest. "When you heard me talking about a nursing home, that was a bitter joke, a dig at how the press expects us to treat you. Between the two of us, we have spent 12 years fighting in the dark to keep your empire standing. Everything we did was for you, my love. It was a masterpiece, the most brilliantly constructed, plausible lie I had ever encountered. Had I not spent 12 years in a cell with nothing but silence to sharpen my thinking, had I not learned to spot a con artist at 10 paces, I might have swallowed every word. The logic held together, the legal language was precise, the emotional performance was immaculate. They had clearly rehearsed this contingency plan down to the last gesture. But they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten that I knew exactly how much money had been sitting in my retirement fund the day I went to prison. And I knew that a legitimate spousal preservation trust does not require routing funds through a chain of anonymous shell companies. They were lying directly to my face. I looked at Warren, I looked at Lynette, and I understood in that moment how truly dangerous they were. If I confronted them right now, they would shred the evidence and likely find a way to make me disappear for good. I had no money, no power, and no allies. What I needed was time. I needed to beat them at their own game. So I let my shoulders drop. I forced a trembling exhale and made my eyes fill. I let a single tear track down my weathered cheek. Then I pulled them both into a tight, emotional embrace. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking with manufactured guilt. "I am so sorry I doubted you. I have been in the dark for so long. Thank you. Thank you both for giving up so much to protect everything I built. I don't know where I would be without you." Lynette pressed her face into my chest and held on tightly. Warren thumped my back with heavy, reassuring pats. "You are home now, Gerald," he said softly. "Everything is going to be okay. We will take care of you from now on." "I know you will," I replied, drawing them closer. But as I stood there staring over Warren's shoulder at the darkened wall of my study, my eyes were bone dry. The warmth I had poured into my voice was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. I did not believe a syllable of what they had told me. They were certain they had just managed a broken, clueless old man. They thought the threat had passed. They were wrong. The war had only just begun. The war had only just begun. I learned the terms of my new existence quickly enough. Under the cover of devoted, attentive care, Warren and Lynette had built a gilded cage around me. My belongings were moved into a cramped, windowless guest room on the ground floor of the estate. The room sat at the far end of a long, isolated corridor, well away from the main living spaces. Warren informed me with a patronizing smile that it was purely for my own well-being. My aging legs shouldn't have to manage the stairs after so many years sleeping on a hard prison cot. I accepted my new quarters without a word of protest. I understood it had nothing to do with my comfort. They wanted me out of sight and out of mind, a convenient ghost drifting along the margins of their polished, glamorous existence. The restrictions reached further than just where I slept. They handed me $80 a week in cash, claiming my bank accounts remained frozen under federal regulations. I had built a $50 million technology empire with my own hands, and now I was being rationed pocket money like a child. On top of that, Warren flatly forbade me from setting foot inside Hargrove Tech headquarters under any circumstances. He cited the relentless media attention that would inevitably trail my release. He warned that my showing up would rattle the stock price and send investors into a panic. I agreed to stay out of sight. I performed the role of the weary, beaten old man, content to find a quiet corner and rest. But behind the closed door of that windowless room, my mind never stopped cataloging every detail, every untruth, every thread of evidence I could find. The proof of their betrayal was all around me, hiding in plain sight. They were arrogant about it. They paraded the wealth they had stripped from me, apparently convinced I was too naive or too broken to see what was right in front of my face. One morning over breakfast, I watched Warren absently adjust his cufflink, and there it was, catching the light, my father's vintage Patek Philippe watch. A rare, intricate piece my father had placed in my hands on his deathbed, explicitly passed to me alone. I had locked it in the master bedroom safe the morning I was arrested. Warren caught my gaze on his wrist. He smiled smoothly and told me he had tracked it down at a pawn shop after federal agents cleared out my personal property. A flat-out lie. Federal agents never touched our family heirlooms. I forced a look of profound gratitude and thanked him warmly for recovering it. Lynette was no different. She moved through the mansion draped in jewelry I knew on sight. One evening, she wore a brilliant diamond necklace to a charity dinner, the exact piece I had custom designed for her on our 10th wedding anniversary. I told her it was stunning. She gave a light, dismissive laugh and said it was just a cheap knockoff she had found at a local boutique, a copy she wore to feel some connection to the life we once had together. She claimed she had sold the original to cover my mounting legal defense costs. She was lying. The way the light broke across those stones was unmistakable. They were real diamonds, my diamonds. They were wearing my life like a costume, staging a grotesque performance in which they were the suffering heroes and I was the helpless burden they endured out of loyalty. But the stolen wealth was not the most chilling part of what they had planned. The true nature of my situation revealed itself in the quiet of the evenings. Every night around 9:00, Lynette would tap softly on my bedroom door. She would come in carrying a delicate porcelain cup of steaming peppermint tea, her expression arranged into a mask of gentle, angelic concern. She told me she had read about prison-induced insomnia and the deep trauma of re-entering society. She insisted the tea was a special organic blend with natural supplements to calm my nerves and ease my exhausted mind. For the first week, I drank it. I wanted to play along to show them I was entirely reliant on their care as helpless as a child. But something deeply unsettling began to happen to my body. Each morning, I woke feeling as though I were pushing through a thick, suffocating fog. My thoughts moved like cold syrup. My vision blurred and softened at the edges. And most frightening of all, my hands began to shake a fine, uncontrollable tremor that I could not will away. I would sit on the edge of the bed, watching my own fingers quiver, powerless to stop them. I was a healthy 70-year-old man who had kept up a rigorous physical routine through my entire prison sentence. I had never had any neurological tremors in my life. I thought back to Lynette's cold, contemptuous voice in the study, joking about how a convict's mind naturally falls apart. I remembered Warren saying they could claim my sanity had eroded behind bars. These tremors were not old age. They were the result of a deliberate, methodical poisoning. I had to test my suspicion without giving anything away. The next night, when Lynette arrived with her steaming cup of peppermint tea, I thanked her with feeling. I took a small, careful sip while she stood watching, praising the soothing warmth of it. Satisfied that I was taking my medicine, she smiled, wished me a good night, and pulled the door shut behind her. The moment her footsteps faded along the hallway, I moved. I carried the cup to the dark corner of the room, where sitting in a heavy ceramic pot was a large, vibrant green pothos that Lynette had placed in the room to make it feel more welcoming. I emptied the cup into the soil. Then I rinsed the cup at my sink and set it on the nightstand ready for Lynette to collect in the morning. I repeated the same routine the following night. The tainted liquid went straight into the roots of the pothos. I watched the plant in silence over the days that followed, waiting to see what the evidence would tell me. It did not take long. Just 2 days later, the once vibrant plant was completely unrecognizable. The leaves had gone a sickly necrotic yellow. The stems had shriveled and folded in on themselves, rotting upward from the roots. The plant was stone dead, killed by whatever chemical cocktail Lynette had been ladling into that porcelain cup every night. I stood in my windowless room, staring at the withered wreckage, my pulse hammering with a terrible, clarifying dread. This was not simply about money. It was not simply about keeping me buried away from the world. They were deliberately inducing dementia through chemistry. They were dissolving my mind to guarantee I could never claw back my life or my $50 million legacy. The gilded cage they had constructed for me was in reality a slow and quiet execution chamber. The understanding that Lynette was actively poisoning me rewired something fundamental at my core. I was no longer a victim trying to make sense of how the people I loved could rob me blind. I was a survivor operating behind enemy lines. During daylight hours, I played my role without a single slip. I let my hands tremble. I shuffled along the hallways with dragging feet. I sat staring blankly out the windows, as though the world beyond the glass no longer registered. But when night fell and the heavy oak doors of the mansion closed for the evening, the fog lifted entirely. My mind, forged across more than 4,000 days inside a federal penitentiary, became razor sharp. The cage they had built for me was about to become my hunting ground. I waited until the tall, long-case clock in the main foyer struck 2. Its low, resonant chime rolled through the sleeping estate. 2 zeros in the morning. I knew Warren and Lynette were heavy sleepers. I slid out of my narrow bed dressed in dark clothing and moved across the cold hardwood floor in bare feet, so as not to produce even the faintest sound. The mansion sat in complete darkness, except for pale moonlight pouring through the tall windows. I moved through the shadows with the silent precision of a ghost. Prison had been an education in moving without being heard, controlling breath, measuring each step, folding yourself into darkness whenever a guard made the nightly rounds. My destination was the East Wing Warren's grand home office, the room that had once been my father's library. I wrapped my hand around the brass knob of the heavy mahogany door, locked exactly as I had expected. Warren was a paranoid man, but his paranoia was amateur work. He believed a standard cylinder lock would keep his secrets buried. He had no conception of the skills a man absorbs when he spends years confined with professional thieves. I reached into my pocket and produced 2 small, rigid slivers of metal I had fashioned earlier that day, one from a thick paper clip, the other from the metal spine of a disposable razor. I fed the makeshift tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole and held it with the lightest pressure of my thumb. Then I worked the pick in feeling out the binding pins one by one. The lock surrendered with a soft, satisfying snap. I eased the handle down, slipped inside, and drew the door shut behind me. The office smelled of rich leather and expensive pipe tobacco. I went straight to the massive oak desk anchoring the center of the room. Warren had always preferred the home office for anything sensitive. I pressed the power button on his sleek desktop. The screen ignited, casting a cold blue glow across my face. A password prompt materialized. I stood still for a moment and thought through my brother's psychology. Warren was a man driven by towering arrogance. He would never bother with a complex, randomized string of characters. He would reach for something familiar, something that fed his ego. I thought about the purebred black Labrador he had bought. Shortly after I went to prison, the dog he treated like a trophy animal. I set my fingers on the keyboard and typed the dog's name, followed by the year he acquired the estate. I hit enter. The system opened immediately. I was in. I began moving through the directories, hunting for anything buried beneath the surface. Warren was meticulous with figures a financial officer through and through, but he was no IT specialist. It did not take me long to locate a hidden partition on the hard drive. Inside, it sat dozens of precisely organized digital ledgers. As I worked through the spreadsheets and absorbed what they were telling me, the blood drained from my face. The scope of his betrayal was catastrophically larger than anything I had imagined. Warren had not merely drained my accounts and stolen my retirement. He had gutted Hargrove Tech and rebuilt it as something monstrous, a full-scale international money laundering syndicate operating beneath the skin of my life's work. The ledgers laid out millions upon millions of dollars flowing in from shell corporations in South America and Eastern Europe. The funds were absorbed into Hargrove Tech's operating expenses, disguised as consulting fees and software licensing acquisitions. From there, the cleaned money was wired out to offshore accounts controlled by a notorious international cartel. Warren was laundering dirty money for some of the most dangerous criminals alive. And the most bone-chilling element was how the paperwork was structured. He was still using my name, my digital signatures, my legacy credentials as the ultimate shield. If federal authorities ever came sniffing around these new transactions, every paper trail would terminate at my feet. He was engineering a second frame-up for me. My hands clamped down on the edge of the desk. The sheer scale of his malice was breathtaking, but I needed more. I needed to understand exactly how it had all been set in motion. I kept excavating the hidden partition, scrolling past the recent cartel ledgers. At the very bottom of the directory, I spotted an encrypted folder marked simply 2013 Archive. The encryption was rudimentary, apparently a relic of older software Warren had never bothered to update. I got past it with a common directory override command. The folder opened and its contents spread across the screen. I stopped breathing. Laid out in high definition were the original unedited financial documents used to secure my conviction. I opened a subfolder and found raw, uncompressed image files of my forged signature. I traced the digital footprints showing precisely how Warren had manipulated the company's internal servers to make it appear that I had personally authorized the illegal transfers. He had painstakingly assembled the entire fiction, concealing his own involvement while painting a target squarely on my back. But that was not what finally broke something inside me. I opened a document titled Witness Preparation Notes. It was a detailed, heavily edited script. Bullet points, emotional cues, exact phrasing. I read it and my stomach lurched violently. It was the testimony Lynette had delivered word for word from the witness stand at my trial. The document specified precisely when she should weep, when she should avert her eyes from the jury, and how she ought to characterize my supposed erratic, greedy conduct. They had rehearsed my destruction together, sitting in this very house, perhaps at this very desk, choreographing every performance that would convince a judge to lock me away for 2 decades. Lynette was no reluctant bystander. She had been the lead performer in a calculated execution. I was no longer simply fighting to recover my money. I was fighting for complete and total vengeance for the 12 years of my life they had consumed. I could not do this alone. The walls of the mansion were closing in, and every piece of technology inside it was tightly monitored. Any internet access would trip Warren's software. I was stranded on an island of their construction. I needed a secure line of communication, and to get one, I would have to pass through the iron gates. The next morning, I began my performance. I dragged myself into the kitchen, feet shuffling, hands shaking with visible violence. Lynette sat at the table sipping coffee, watching me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed revulsion. I let my jaw go slack and adopted the empty, drifting gaze of a man losing his grip on reality. I muttered that my room felt like a prison cell. I said all I wanted was to feel the sun and sit quietly in the local park. Lynette sighed, visibly annoyed, but she saw the calculation in it. Letting the neighbors witness a senile old man shuffling down the street would only reinforce their narrative that prison had shattered my mind. She agreed, but she was not careless enough to let me move unsupervised. She called for a man named Bruno. He was introduced as a private healthcare aide, but the mass and density of his build told a very different story. He was a hired thug, placed there to make certain I never strayed beyond their reach. Bruno followed me down the long driveway and out onto the quiet sidewalk, maintaining a deliberate 30-foot gap to sustain the illusion that I was a free man. Every step I took was a performance agonizingly slow, labored as though the pavement itself were fighting me. In reality, my muscles were coiled and ready. I was scanning everything around me for the right opening. We reached the local park, a stretch of green threaded with oak trees and scattered benches. I spotted my target immediately. A teenage boy perched on a stone retaining wall, thumbs hammering a cheap smartphone, a battered bicycle helmet resting against his leg. A kid like that cycled through devices constantly and held on to his old ones. I shuffled toward a bench near him, deliberately catching my foot on a crack in the pavement. I let out a loud groan and dropped onto the bench, one hand clutching my chest. Bruno drifted to a comfortable spot against an oak tree and pulled out his own phone, thoroughly bored by his babysitting assignment. He glanced away for exactly 5 seconds. That was everything I needed. I angled toward the boy, and the trembling in my hands stopped instantly. I produced a crumpled $40 bill from my pocket, half the weekly allowance Warren had handed me. I fixed the kid with a direct look. I pointed to the cracked older phone sitting beside him on the wall. I whispered a sharp offer, $40 for the old device. The boy blinked surprised, but $40 was an effortless trade for a piece of junk plastic. He snatched the bill and nudged the phone toward my foot with his heel. In one fluid motion, I swept the device under the sole of my shoe. When Bruno looked back up, I was simply rubbing my knee. I sat there for another 10 minutes, building a pattern of dull, harmless inactivity. Bruno eventually lost interest and turned away to light a cigarette. I worked the phone out from under my shoe and tucked it inside the folds of my oversized jacket. I powered it on. Battery 14%. Any deactivated handset can still reach public wireless networks. I connected immediately to the unsecured signal from a nearby coffee shop, opened an encrypted messaging application, and typed. I did not need a contact list. Over 12 years, I had held one sequence of numbers in my memory like a lifeline. It was Garrison Pendleton's contact information. Garrison had been my corporate attorney, a fiercely loyal man who fought for me at trial with everything he had. Because he refused to bend to Warren's pressure, Warren had engineered a vicious smear campaign against him, manufacturing ethical violations serious enough to get him disbarred. Garrison had sacrificed a distinguished career simply for standing by my side. Last I heard, he was grinding away as a paralegal in a rundown office, barely keeping the lights on. I dialed. The line rang 3 times before a tired voice came through. Pendleton speaking. It said drained and flat. I cupped my hand over my mouth and kept my head low so Bruno could not read my lips. Garrison. I breathed, my voice steady. It's Gerald. A sharp intake of breath. Silence stretched between us as he absorbed the sound of my voice. When he spoke again, the exhaustion was gone, replaced by a focused, vibrating intensity. Gerald, Garrison breathed. They said you were out. I've been waiting for a signal. I knew you wouldn't just disappear. They think I'm a broken, demented old man, I whispered back. They think they've got me locked inside a cage. But I found the ledgers. I found the archive. I know exactly what Warren did and who helped him. The hunt is on. I heard a chair scrape hard across a floor on his end. Tell me what you need, boss. I have spent 12 years waiting to tear that arrogant bastard down. Just give me the word, and I will burn his fraudulent empire to the ground. I need you to activate the contingencies we laid out during your last visit to the prison, I instructed. But first I need to know his operational timeline. What is his immediate objective? Garrison's voice dropped an octave, sharpening into something deadly serious. You need to move fast, Gerald. I still have solid contacts working quietly inside the financial district. They have been feeding me information about Hargrove Tech. Warren isn't just laundering money for the cartel anymore. He's looking for an exit, trying to cut ties with the operation and walk away clean. What do you mean? I asked, my eyes ticking over toward Bruno, who was checking his wristwatch. He's closing a corporate acquisition, Garrison said grimly. Warren has brokered a deal to sell Hargrove Tech to a European conglomerate. The buyers are heavily insulated, almost certainly another front for his criminal partners. The buyout is structured for $300 million in clean, untraceable capital. The moment he signs that company over, he and Lynette take the money and vanish into a non-extradition country. You get left holding an empty shell. When does the deal close? I demanded, a surge of adrenaline moving through me like a current. By the end of this month, Garrison replied, his tone bleak. You have less than 3 weeks before he legally transfers ownership and disappears with everything you built. If that signature lands on the transfer deed, the European buyers will liquidate the assets, gut the infrastructure, and bury the evidence permanently. I sat staring at the dry, dead grass beneath my feet, mapping the geometry of my next move. The clock had just been introduced to the board. 3 weeks. I had exactly 3 weeks to dismantle a criminal enterprise, expose my treacherous brother, and take everything back before they evaporated forever. I will be completely ready. I promised him, barely above a whisper, cutting the connection and easing the cheap phone back into the depth of my heavy shoe. That evening, the grand dining room felt like a room, with the walls moving inward. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, staring at a bowl of bland soup. Warren occupied the head of the table, carving a thick steak with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who is certain he owns everything in view. Lynette sat opposite him, lifting a glass of red wine with practiced elegance. They talked around me about nothing in particular, treating me like a piece of furniture that had always been there. But I knew Warren. I knew the exact cadence of his voice when a trap was being set. He wiped his mouth, took a measured sip of wine, and shifted his gaze in my direction. Those eyes were sharp, calculating, stripped of any genuine warmth. He smiled, the kind of smile a predator assembles just before it moves. Gerald A. Stores, Warren began, his voice thick with manufactured concern. The transition back to normal life, we know how overwhelming it has been. We just want you focused entirely on resting. But there is one small piece of paperwork we need to resolve tonight to guarantee your complete protection. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document, sliding it across the polished tabletop until it came to rest beside my bowl. I looked down. My vision was slightly soft from Lynette's tainted tea, but I did not need sharp eyes to understand what I was reading. The bold black heading spelled it out: a full liability waiver and rights relinquishment. This is purely a formality. Warren continued, his tone smooth and practiced. Federal regulators are circling our offshore trust, and our legal team strongly advises that you formally detach yourself from the corporate entity. Signing this means you legally surrender any future claim to Hargrove Tech. You become judgment-proof. They can never pursue you for financial restitution. You will be entirely protected, and Lynette and I will go on taking care of you. I stared at the document. This was the final nail in the coffin. This was the precise piece of paper Warren needed to execute the $300 million buyout with his European associates. Without my signature, the buyers would never absorb the risk of a lingering legal dispute. He needed me to willingly hand over the keys. I let my hands begin to shake. I widened my eyes and arranged my face into an expression of profound, senile confusion. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper, my fingers trembling in violent little arcs. Warren. I mumbled, my voice thin and raspy. I don't understand. Hargrove Tech is my life. I built it from nothing. Why do I have to sign my name away? Can't we wait just a little longer? I feel so confused lately. My head is always so cloudy. The warm smile slid off Warren's face. A flicker of real irritation crossed it in its place. He opened his mouth, but Lynette got there first. The gentle, angelic front she had maintained for days shattered completely. She set her wineglass down on the table with a sharp, aggressive crack. She leaned forward, elbows on the mahogany surface, eyes drilling into mine with cold, venomous precision. "Gerald, honey," Lynette said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You need to hear us very carefully. The doctors have been explicit. Your mind is deteriorating fast. The years in prison accelerated your cognitive decline. We see it every single day. You shuffle through the house. You cannot hold on to simple conversations. Your hands will not stop shaking." She tilted her head, her eyes cutting straight through me like a blade. "If you refuse to sign this paperwork and protect the family, Warren and I may have no choice but to pursue a full medical conservatorship. Should the state rule you mentally incompetent, this comfortable home will no longer be an option for you. Surely you don't want to live out your remaining years strapped to a bed in some sterile psychiatric ward, erased from the world entirely. The savagery of that threat settled over the room like a fog. She had a loaded gun pressed directly against my freedom. They were entirely willing to have me legally declared insane and committed to an institution. I knew precisely what had to be done. I sucked in a loud, pitiful gasp and deliberately let my heavy silver soup spoon slip from my fingers. It struck the porcelain bowl with a clatter and bounced onto the floor. I yanked my hands back, clutching them against my chest as though seized by panic. I let my whole body tremble, inhabiting the role of the shattered old man completely. "Please!" I whimpered, my eyes going wide and fearful as they fixed on the document. "Please, Lynette, don't send me away to a hospital. I cannot go back to a cage. I cannot be locked up again. I will sign the paper." Warren exhaled a quiet breath of relief, and that arrogant smile of his came flooding back immediately. He reached into his pocket, produced a gold pen, and held it out across the table toward me. "That is a smart decision, Gerald," he said in a soothing tone. "Just sign on the dotted line, and every one of your worries disappears forever." I reached for the pen, then wrenched my hand back sharply, shaking my head in rapid little jerks. I forced a mask of stubborn senility across my face, clinging to a manufactured shred of dignity. "No," I stammered, my voice climbing into a frantic, wavering plea. "Not here, not in the dark. Hargrove Tech was my entire life. If I have to sign it away, I won't do it in secret like some criminal. I want to say goodbye the right way." Warren's brow dropped into a frown. "What are you talking about, Gerald? Just sign the paper. Next week is the 30th anniversary of the company." I burst out, shaking with manic insistence. "You're hosting the grand anniversary gala, I know you are. If I'm surrendering everything I built, I want to do it there. I want to stand on a stage one final time. I'll sign your paper in front of everyone as a proper farewell to my legacy. If you won't give me that one last thing, I won't sign it at all." Silence dropped over the room. Warren and Lynette traded a quick, calculating look between them. Having the company's founder publicly relinquish his rights at a corporate gala would be an extraordinary public relations coup. It would cement his ownership in the eyes of the European buyers. It was an erratic demand from a seemingly broken man, but it served his agenda beautifully. Warren set the gold pen down. He regarded me with a look of deep performative pity and absolute victory. "If that's what it takes to give you peace, Gerald," he said gently, "then we'll do this your way. You'll sign the relinquishment at the gala next week." I bowed my head and buried my face in my trembling hands, performing the grief of a man watching his empire slip away. But behind my fingers, hidden from those treacherous eyes, my lips pulled into a cold, quiet smile. The trap was set. They had no idea whatsoever. "I'll be completely ready," I murmured, ending the secure call and easing the cheap mobile phone back into the sole of my heavy shoe. The slow walk back to the sprawling estate felt nothing like the walk out had. Every step I took now was driven by a cold, focused purpose. I had a firm timeline at last. 3 short weeks to methodically tear apart the fortress my brother had constructed on top of everything he'd stolen from me. When I arrived back at the mansion, I slipped immediately back into character, shuffling through the grand foyer, shoulders rounded, eyes trained on the polished floor. I let my left hand quiver, just enough to catch the eye of any security camera watching. The gilded cage was tightening around me, yet they had absolutely no idea I had just gotten hold of the key to lock them inside it. That evening, the dining room felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The vast mahogany table stretched between us like a no man's land. I sat at the far end, staring into a bowl of flavorless soup. Warren occupied the head of the table, sawing through a thick cut of steak, with the aggressive confidence of a man who considers the world already his. Lynette sat across from him, lifting a glass of dark red wine with practiced elegance. They kept up a conversation about inconsequential social engagements, treating my presence as though it simply didn't exist. But I knew Warren. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, took a measured sip of wine, and slowly turned his eyes toward me, sharp, calculating, utterly stripped of anything resembling real warmth. "Gerald," Warren began, his voice saturated with manufactured concern, "I understand that returning to ordinary life after everything you've been through has been an enormous adjustment. but there is a minor piece of paperwork we need to settle this evening, purely for your protection." He slipped a hand inside his tailored jacket, produced a neatly folded document, and slid it across the polished table until it came to rest beside my soup bowl. In heavy black letters across the top of the page, "Full liability, waiver and rights relinquishment." "This is nothing more than a formality," Warren continued smoothly, "because federal regulators are still aggressively circling our offshore trust. Our legal team strongly advises that you formally sever yourself from the corporate entity once and for all. By signing, you legally surrender any future claim to Hargrove Tech and its holdings. You'll be classified as fully destitute in the eyes of the law, meaning the government can never come after you for financial restitution. You will be protected, and Lynette and I will go on caring for you for whatever time you have left." I stared at that thick white page. This was the precise document Warren needed to close the $300 million deal with his European cartel associates. Without my verified signature surrendering all rights, the buyers would never risk taking on a legal challenge from the company's original founder. He needed me to hand over the keys to the kingdom willingly. I let my hands begin to tremble. I widened my eyes into an expression of deep, bewildered confusion. I extended my fingers toward the edge of the paper, letting them shake against the tabletop. "Warren." I mumbled my voice, thin and raspy words deliberately blurring together. "I don't understand. Hargrove Tech is my life. I built it out of nothing. Why do I have to sign away my own name? Can't we just wait a little longer? I've been feeling so confused lately." The warm fraternal smile drained from Warren's face in an instant, a flicker of naked irritation taking its place. He opened his mouth, but Lynette cut him off. The soft, angelic front she'd maintained for weeks crumbled entirely. She brought her crystal wine glass down against the table with a hard, sharp crack. Her gaze locked onto mine, cold, precise, and venomous. "Gerald, honey," Lynette said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "You need to hear what we are telling you very carefully. The doctors have been absolutely unambiguous about your condition. They say your mind is deteriorating quickly. The trauma of federal prison accelerated your cognitive decline. We see the signs every single day. You can't hold on to simple conversations, and your hands won't stop shaking." She tilted her head, her eyes cutting straight through to my core. "If you won't sign this paperwork tonight to protect the family, Warren and I may have no choice but to seek a full medical conservatorship. Should the state find you mentally unfit to make your own decisions, this comfortable home will no longer be available to you. Surely you wouldn't want to spend your final years locked away in a psychiatric ward, strapped to a bed forgotten by the world." The raw brutality of the threat hung thick in the air. She was pressing a loaded gun directly against my freedom. They were entirely prepared to have me declared legally insane and locked away in an institution if I pushed back. I knew exactly what had to be done. I let out a loud, pitiful gasp and deliberately let my silver soup spoon slip from my grip. It rang out against the porcelain and tumbled onto the hardwood floor. I pulled my hands back and pressed them tight to my chest. I let my whole body shake, inhabiting the role of the frightened, broken old man with everything I had. "Please," I whimpered, staring at the document with wide, helpless eyes. "Please, Lynette, don't send me to a hospital. I cannot go back to a cage. I will sign the paper." Warren let out a breath of relief. That arrogant smile reappeared on his face. He drew the gold pen from his pocket and extended it toward me across the table. "That is a smart decision, Gerald," he said. "Just sign your name on the dotted line." I reached for the pen, then wrenched my hand sharply back, shaking my head in rapid little jerks. I forced a mask of stubborn senility across my face. "No," I stammered, voice climbing into a frantic plea. "Not here, not in the dark. Hargrove Tech was my entire life. If I have to sign it away, I won't do it in secret like some hidden criminal. I want to say goodbye the right way." Warren's face creased with irritation. "What on earth are you talking about? Gerald just signed the paper." "Next week is the 30th anniversary of the company," I burst out, shaking with manic insistence. "You're hosting the anniversary gala. If I'm surrendering my life's work, I want to do it there. I want to stand on a stage one final time. I'll sign your paper in front of everyone, a proper farewell to the legacy I built. Deny me that one last thing, and I won't sign it at all." The dining room went silent. Warren and Lynette traded a long, measured look between them. Having the company's founder publicly relinquish his rights at a high-profile corporate gala would be an extraordinary public relations triumph. It would fully legitimize Warren's ownership for the buyers. It was an erratic demand from a seemingly shattered man, yet it served his agenda perfectly. Warren set the heavy gold pen down slowly on the polished mahogany surface. He fixed me with a look of deep performative pity and absolute victory. "If that is what brings you peace, Gerald," he said quietly, "then we'll do it your way. You'll sign the relinquishment at the gala next week." I bowed my head and buried my face in my trembling hands, performing the grief of a man watching everything he ever built drain away. But behind those fingers, hidden from their treacherous eyes, my lips pulled into a cold, quiet smile. The trap was finally set. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The following morning, Warren announced a mandatory medical evaluation before the corporate transfer could be legally finalized. A private phlebotomist arrived at the estate. It was Garrison dressed immaculately in blue medical scrubs and a white surgical mask. He played the consummate professional without a crack in the performance, instructing me to walk with him to the guest bathroom. Lynette watched from the hallway like a hawk, but she didn't follow us inside. The moment the door closed, Garrison turned the faucet on to cover our voices. He drew a small vial of my blood to make the visit look entirely legitimate. As he pressed a bandage over the puncture, he reached into his case and produced a heavy silver fountain pen and a tiny flesh-colored earpiece, pressing both firmly into my palm. "The pen has a specialized ink cartridge," Garrison whispered. "The ink will vanish completely within 24 hours of touching paper. The earpiece is synced to a secure frequency. Wear it at the gala. And Gerald, I finally got through to my contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The trap is primed. If Warren catches on before you use that pen, they'll have you locked in an asylum before dawn." I nodded and slipped the pen and earpiece into my pocket. Garrison packed his case, shut off the faucet, and walked me back out. Lynette examined my bandaged arm and seemed satisfied. Garrison departed the estate, leaving me entirely alone in the lion's den once more. The days leading up to the anniversary gala were an exercise in psychological endurance. Warren and Lynette grew increasingly watchful as the buyout date closed in. They needed my mind to appear completely broken before they placed me on a stage before the cameras. Lynette intensified her efforts. She began coming to my room twice daily, carrying steaming cups of her toxic peppermint tea, standing over me with cold, unyielding eyes, and refusing to leave until I'd swallowed every last drop. I had to adapt fast. Simply pouring the tea into a potted plant was no longer an option with her watching my every move. I mastered the precarious art of palming the neurotoxic pills she had dissolved into the liquid. I would take a sip, hold the bitter fluid at the back of my throat, and feign a swallow, while letting the sediment collect in a small piece of tissue folded in my cupped hand. It was a terrifying high-stakes performance. Had I swallowed even a fraction of the heavy dosage she was administering, my mind would have genuinely fractured. I spent long hours alone in my room, scrubbing my tongue and rinsing my mouth to purge every trace of the poison. I kept my facade intact, shaking hands, drifting eyes, giving them precisely the hollow, diminished man they were counting on. Warren's arrogance swelled to unbearable proportions that week. He began parading the so-called European investors through the estate. I knew exactly who those men were, high-level cartel representatives buttoned into tailored Italian suits, costumed as legitimate businessmen. Warren would usher them into the grand dining room, offering them my expensive pipe tobacco and pouring out my rare scotch. He would gesture toward me, sitting quietly in the corner, introducing me as his tragic senile brother, who had lost his grip on reality after his years in prison. The men would look at me with mocking pity, laughing along with Warren's cruel jokes. I sat completely still, biting the inside of my cheek, absorbing every insult and committing every face in that room to memory. The breaking point came 2 days before the gala. The cartel representatives had just cleared the estate, and Warren was riding a wave of pure intoxicated adrenaline. He poured himself another glass and strolled into the living room, where I sat by the fireplace. He positioned himself in front of the roaring flames, admiring his reflection in the large ornate mirror above the mantel. Then he slowly unclasped my father's vintage watch from his wrist. He held the gold timepiece up to the light, turning it in his hands with an expression of profound self-satisfaction. He set the watch deliberately at the center of the mantel, right beside a framed family photograph taken 20 years ago. He looked down at me, his eyes carrying decades of suppressed jealousy and bitter resentment. "You know, Gerald," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "The old man always favored the weaker son. He gave you the company. He gave you the watch. He treated you like his golden child, while I did all the real work behind the scenes. But look at us now. Look at where his precious golden child ended up. You're a broken convict waiting to be committed, and I'm about to become one of the wealthiest men in the country. The world always corrects its mistakes eventually." The sheer audacity of those words sent a blinding wave of rage surging through me. Every instinct screamed at me to rise from that chair. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and not let go. I had to bite down on my tongue so savagely that the sharp metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I forced myself to stare at the floor, shoulders trembling, playing the role of the defeated coward. I swallowed my blood, and my pride reminding myself that real justice demands absolute, unwavering patience. At last the night of the gala arrived. The mansion crackled with nervous electricity. Lynette swept into my room carrying a garment bag, which she dropped onto my bed without ceremony. She had deliberately selected an outdated, ill-fitting tuxedo from the back of my closet, the jacket 2 full sizes too large, the trousers pooling around my ankles. She wanted me to look as diminished and pathetic as possible the moment I stepped onto that stage. She wanted the world to see a man who had surrendered completely. I dressed slowly, letting my fingers fumble over the buttons. Lynette moved in close to adjust my collar, then aggressively pinned a white boutonniere to my wide lapel, the sharp pin grazing my chest. She seized my chin and tilted my face up until I was staring directly into her cold, merciless eyes. "Smile for the cameras tonight, old man," she hissed, her breath hot against my face. "Do exactly what we rehearsed. You walk up those stairs, you sign your name on that paper, and you smile, because after tonight, you officially cease to exist." I held her gaze, letting my jaw tremble in manufactured fear. But deep in the pocket of my oversized trousers, my fingers curled tightly around the cold silver barrel of Garrison's fountain pen. I was ready, more than ready. 12 long years of isolation had tempered my soul into something unbreakable. I drew a slow, silent breath and steadied the pounding in my chest. They believed they were marching me to the slaughter. They were walking themselves to the gallows. Tonight, you officially cease to exist. Lynette's venomous words still rang in my head as the limousine pulled away toward the Jefferson Hotel. The interior of the car was suffocatingly quiet. Lynette sat directly across from me, spine rigid, her eyes moving over my deliberately disheveled appearance with cold, calculating assessment. What you are about to witness took me years to arrange, every quiet move, every careful step, all leading to a single night where everything would either come together or fall apart completely. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If the people closest to you had been working against you in silence, would you rather confront them the moment you knew or let them walk right into the trap they built for themselves? I kept my gaze on the passing city lights through the tinted glass jaw hanging slack to sell the illusion completely. When the limousine doors swung open, a storm of camera flashes exploded into the crisp Richmond night. I gripped the aluminum handle of my heavy cane, forcing my knuckles to shake as I hauled myself out of the back seat. Reporters called out my name, their voices a deafening collision of morbid curiosity and predatory excitement. I rounded my shoulders forward, shrinking from the blinding strobes like a frightened, broken creature. I dragged my feet along the red carpet, letting the rubber tip of my cane scrape against the fabric to sell my manufactured frailty. Lynette stepped out right behind me, instantly becoming the tragic, fiercely devoted wife. She placed a guiding hand at the small of my back, running interference against the press, while presenting the cameras with a flawlessly crafted smile of weary, deep sorrow. Every step toward those grand brass doors was a meticulously rehearsed act. I let my breathing go ragged and shallow, painting the picture of a ruined convict utterly adrift in a world that had long since moved on. We passed through the entrance, and the doors cut off the shouting reporters behind us. Crystal chandeliers poured golden light over hundreds of guests in tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns, industry elites, corporate titans, and powerful investors who had once competed for my attention and begged for my business. 12 years ago, when federal agents swept through my offices, every last one of them had dropped me without hesitation. They had erased my number, voided our contracts, and publicly condemned me to protect their own fragile reputations. Now, as I shuffled through the crowded room, the sea of elegant guests parted before me, conversations cut off mid-sentence. I felt the suffocating pressure of their stares bearing down on my hunched shoulders. Pity flickered in their eyes, rapidly giving way to quiet disgust. They were looking at a ghost, a grim cautionary tale of corporate greed, who had spent more than a decade rotting in a concrete cell. I kept my eyes fixed on the intricate geometric patterns of the marble floor, refusing to meet the gaze of the cowards who had abandoned me to my fate. I let my hands tremble visibly as we moved through the hushed crowd, feeding every one of their arrogant assumptions. They were utterly convinced they were watching a pathetic, senile old man who had gotten exactly what he deserved. Not one of them had any idea that the frail convict shuffling past them was quietly cataloging every face in that room, preparing to burn their entire corrupt world to the ground. At the far end of the ballroom, holding court near the stage, stood my brother. Warren looked every inch the sovereign. He wore a custom-tailored suit, my father's vintage watch gleaming on his wrist as he worked a group of 4 distinct men with practiced handshakes. They had been introduced to the room as prominent European investors, wealthy saviors, supposedly injecting $300 million of clean capital into Hargrove Tech. I knew exactly what they were. I recognized the flat, dead quality behind their eyes, and the rigid, disciplined way they carried themselves as a group. These were not venture capitalists. They were high-level financial operatives for an international cartel, buttoned into expensive silk and imported leather to execute the ultimate money-laundering transaction. Warren clapped one of the men on the back and laughed at some shared joke projecting the image of a masterful corporate visionary. Then the overhead lights dimmed and the room settled. Warren smoothly excused himself from the cartel representatives and climbed the stairs to the grand stage. He stepped to the clear crystal podium and adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. A massive digital screen behind him displayed the 30-year anniversary logo of the company I had built with my own hands. Warren cleared his throat, and his amplified voice rolled through the ballroom. What followed was a sickeningly polished, deeply hypocritical speech. He spoke at length about the crushing challenges of the past decade, the weight of executive leadership, and the painful necessity of steering a family legacy through profound darkness. He addressed my long incarceration with feigned sorrow, calling it a tragic chapter that had at last reached a peaceful resolution. He cast himself as the tireless, devoted guardian of the Hargrove name, the loyal brother who had sacrificed everything to preserve my original vision from total ruin. The audience hung on every word, completely captivated by his masterful performance. He closed by, announcing the dawn of a bold new era, a major corporate buyout that would secure the company's future for generations. But before we finalize this historic transition, Warren said, his voice dropping to a reverent, emotional whisper, "I want to formally honor the man who started it all. He has suffered greatly, and his mind is not what it once was, but he is here tonight to give us his final blessing. Please welcome my brother, Gerald Hargrove." The grand ballroom answered with polite, measured applause. Warren extended his hand toward me, beckoning me to join him under the bright lights of the stage. Beside me, Lynette's gentle guiding hand transformed instantly into a rigid iron vise. Her sharp manicured fingers drove into my bicep, through the thin fabric of my oversized jacket, marching me forward with terrifying purpose through the parting crowd. I leaned hard on my cane, dragging my feet across the thick carpet, making every step look like an exhausting, monumental effort. Lynette steered me toward the short flight of stairs leading up to the stage. I stumbled deliberately on the first step and let out a soft, pitiful gasp for the nearest guest to hear. She hauled me upward, her painted smile never wavering for the cameras, though her grip felt exactly like a shackle dragging a condemned man to the gallows. I reached the top of the stairs and shuffled slowly toward the podium. There, resting directly beneath the harsh glare of a single overhead spotlight, sat a thick stack of legal documents. The final $300 million relinquishment contract, the precise piece of paper engineered to legally erase my existence and deliver my empire into the hands of ruthless criminals. I stared down at those crisp white pages, my body shaking uncontrollably for the captivated audience, while my mind locked onto the cold, heavy silver fountain pen, nestled safely in my jacket pocket. The silence pressing in from the ballroom felt like a physical weight against my chest. I stood at the podium and looked out over the vast sea of expectant faces. The camera flashes went still, as if the entire room had drawn a single collective breath and was holding it. Immediately to my left stood a state-appointed notary, a stern-faced woman clutching an official leather-bound folio. She was there to certify that I was of sound enough mind to sign away what remained of my life. To my right stood Warren. My brother was practically vibrating with barely contained euphoria. His eyes were wide lit up with a greedy, undisguised triumph he could not suppress. He had waited 12 long years for this exact moment, destroying my reputation, seizing my wealth, poisoning my tea, all of it leading to this finish line. Warren took a deliberate step toward me. He reached inside his custom-tailored tuxedo and produced a heavy gold pen. It was the same pen my father had used to sign the original incorporation papers for the family business decades ago. Warren held it out with careful positioning, angled so the cameras could capture the poetic, tragic transfer of power. He wanted the world to witness the broken founder using a family heirloom to surrender his legacy. He guided the tip toward the thick stack of legal documents on the podium. "Gerald," Warren said, projecting a soothing warmth for the audience. "It is time. Just sign your name on the marked lines and you can finally rest." I stared at the gold pen. I let my breathing turn shallow and erratic. I raised my right hand and let my fingers tremble so violently they appeared incapable of gripping anything at all. I reached toward the pen he was offering, then stopped. I drew my hand back, shaking my head with a slow, exaggerated motion of stubborn resistance. I reached instead into the deep pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket. My fingers found the cold, heavy silver barrel of the specialized fountain pen Garrison had smuggled to me. I pulled it out slowly, holding it with both shaking hands so it wouldn't slip. "I prefer to use my own," I mumbled, letting my voice crack just enough to sound pathetic. Warren's brow dropped into a frown as his eyes landed on the silver pen. He didn't recognize it, but he didn't care enough to push back. He only wanted the signature. He offered a tight, condescending smile and stepped back, gesturing broadly toward the paperwork. "Have it your way, Gerald," he replied smoothly. "As long as you sign the documents." I turned my full attention to the thick stack of contracts. The harsh overhead spotlight beat down on the crisp white pages. I could see the dotted lines waiting for my name. I knew exactly what this ink was engineered to do. Garrison had designed it perfectly. The chemical composition would bind to the paper for precisely 24 hours, appearing entirely legitimate to the notary and the buyers. But the moment it was exposed to open air for a full day, the molecular structure would collapse entirely. The ink would vanish without leaving a single trace. By tomorrow night, the $300 million relinquishment contract would be nothing but a stack of blank, worthless paper. I bent over the podium. I leaned my weight onto my left arm, keeping my aluminum walking cane propped awkwardly against my hip. I positioned the silver fountain pen above the first dotted line. I made sure my hand shook violently for the cameras the press needed to see a man struggling to control his own motor functions. I let the silver tip hover above the paper, trembling back and forth. But the moment the metal nib actually touched the document, the shaking stopped entirely. My mind snapped into a state of absolute unbreakable focus. I executed my signature with complete precision, the strong, decisive mark of the man who had built Hargrove Tech from a garage into a global empire. I moved to the second page, then the third. I signed away my patents. I signed away my voting rights. I signed away my corporate equity. After each page, I let my hand resume its violent trembling, keeping the illusion perfectly intact. The whole process took 3 agonizing minutes. The ballroom was so still, I could hear the scratch of the metal nib dragging across the paper. When I reached the final page and applied the last stroke of my name, I let out a loud, shuddering sigh. I dropped the silver fountain pen onto the podium, letting it clatter sharply against the glass surface. I slumped backward, gripping my cane with both hands, looking every bit like a man who had just finished a grueling marathon and collapsed at the finish line. Warren didn't waste a single second. The moment the pen left my fingers, he lunged. He snatched the thick stack of papers off the podium with the aggressive speed of a starving animal, not even pausing to let the notary inspect the pages. He held the signed contracts up in the air, clutching them like a hard-won championship trophy. He turned to face the crowd, his face blazing with absolute unadulterated victory. The ballroom responded at once. The audience broke into polite, restrained applause. The cartel representatives seated in the front row gave quiet nods of satisfaction, knowing their massive money laundering operation was now legally shielded. Photographers snapped hundreds of frames capturing the triumphant new owner and the defeated, ruined founder standing weakly in the background. Lynette stepped up onto the stage, joining Warren in the spotlight. She slid her arm around his waist and smiled radiantly for the press. They had won. They had cleared every obstacle, poisoned my mind, stripped my wealth, and legally locked in their $300 million exit strategy. Lynette rested her head against his shoulder, eyes closing in pure relief. The nightmare of my return was finished for them. They had pulled off the ultimate corporate heist right in front of the entire world, and no one in that room suspected a thing. They were completely, absolutely untouchable. Warren lowered the papers and turned his back to the applauding audience. He stepped in close to me, keeping that warm, brotherly smile trained on the cameras. But as he leaned in to embrace me, his lips pressed directly against my ear. His voice fell to a vicious, mocking whisper only I could hear. "Thanks for the company, loser?" Warren hissed, his breath reeking of expensive bourbon. "The men in white coats are waiting for you at the back exit. Have a nice life in the psych ward." He pulled away and gave my shoulder a firm, patronizing pat. He turned back to the microphone, hands raised to quiet the applauding crowd. He was preparing to deliver his grand closing remarks, ready to officially dismiss me from the stage and out of his life forever. But instead of walking away, I stood up straight. The fabricated weakness drained from my legs in an instant. I drew myself up to full height, towering over the podium, with the commanding presence I had buried for 12 years. I loosened my grip on the cane. I didn't need it, not today. I let it slip from my fingers. I tossed it off the edge of the stage. The solid weight of it hit the marble floor below with a violent thud. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot cutting across polite applause. Every eye in the room snapped toward the stage. They expected to see a frail, broken man crumpling under the weight of his own tragic story. They expected the defeated founder of Hargrove Tech collapsing into a heap of sorrow and regret. But that is not what they saw. The manufactured weakness that had consumed my every movement for the past 3 weeks evaporated in an absolute instant. I straightened my spine, pulled my shoulders back, and lifted my chin. The stooped, shuffling posture of a heavily sedated convict dissolved, replaced by the towering, unyielding presence of a man who had forged a $50 million empire from nothing. I stepped forward. I did not drag my feet. My stride was long, powerful, and loaded with a terrifying, long-suppressed energy. Warren stood right beside the crystal podium, his arrogant smile frozen in place as he tried to process the sudden, impossible transformation unfolding before him. He opened his mouth, probably another vicious whisper to keep me in line, but before he could form the first syllable, I raised my arm. I didn't strike him. I simply pressed my hand firmly against his chest and pushed him aside. The force behind it stunned him completely. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes skidding on the smooth stage floor, nearly losing his footing entirely. I stepped into his place and gripped the edges of the crystal podium with rock-solid, perfectly steady hands. The bright overhead spotlight washed across my face. I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Warren," I said. My voice did not shake. It carried no trace of senile confusion, no wavering, no crack. It rang out through the massive speakers, deep, sharp, and commanding, vibrating with the full authority I had suppressed for 12 long years. The sound of my true voice hit the audience like a physical blow. The polite applause died instantly, swallowed by a suffocating, bewildered silence. I stared directly at the front row, locking eyes with the 4 men in tailored Italian suits who had been presented as European venture capitalists. "But before the buyers wire $300 million into your offshore accounts," I said, "I believe they should know exactly what they are actually purchasing today." A collective gasp rolled through the ballroom. The corporate titans and industry elites exchanged nervous, baffled glances. The cartel representatives at the front row went rigid, their relaxed posture snapping, instantly predatory. They knew immediately that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their perfect money laundering transaction. Warren recovered his balance and lunged back toward the podium, face flushed with sudden frantic panic. "Gerald, stop this right now," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough to stay off the microphone, though the raw terror in his eyes spoke louder than any words. He reached out and grabbed for my arm, trying desperately to drag me away from center stage. I simply shifted my weight and blocked him with my shoulder, standing like an immovable wall of solid granite. Warren realized he could not physically remove me without creating a massive, humiliating spectacle in front of the flashing press cameras. He lunged frantically for the small control panel on the edge of the podium, fingers hammering down on the mute button to cut the audio feed. He pressed it once. He pressed it twice. He slammed his fist against the plastic console. Nothing happened. The microphone remained completely live, picking up every ragged, panicked breath he drew and broadcasting it to the entire room. What he did not know was that the audiovisual booth overlooking the grand ballroom was no longer under hotel staff control. Garrison Pendleton, my fiercely loyal former attorney, had slipped in through the catering entrance 10 minutes ago. He was now seated in the darkened control room, in a stolen uniform, the main soundboard physically locked down under his hands. Garrison had overridden the podium controls entirely, ensuring that no one standing on that stage could cut my microphone off. Warren stared at the glowing green light on the microphone, his mind coming apart as he realized his technological failsafe had been disabled entirely. When technology failed him, Lynette decided to take matters into her own hands. She broke from her frozen position near the stage stairs and rushed forward, heels clicking sharply against the floor. She threw herself toward me, abandoning all elegance for raw, desperate survival instinct. She waved her arms frantically at the venue security guards stationed around the room's perimeter. "Guards, get up here right now!" Lynette screamed, her voice shrill and bouncing off the silent ballroom walls. "Please, you have to help my husband. Grab him and take him out the back doors immediately." She spun toward the audience, forcing a look of agonized, tearful sorrow onto her panicked face. "I am so incredibly sorry, everyone. Please forgive this disruption. Gerald is having a severe dementia episode. The prison trauma has completely broken his mind. He does not know where he is or what he is saying. The doctors warned us this psychological break would come. We need medical professionals right now." Two large security guards in dark suits moved hesitantly toward the stage stairs, unsure how to proceed. They had been briefed to handle a confused, unpredictable convict, but the man standing at the podium looked neither crazy nor lost. I looked directly at the approaching guards and raised one hand in a calm, commanding gesture that left no room for argument. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, their instincts telling them not to cross me. I turned my attention back to the woman who had orchestrated my destruction. Lynette stood 2 feet away, chest-heaving eyes silently begging me to crumble and surrender. I looked at the beautiful, treacherous face of the woman I had once loved more than my own life. I remembered the 12 years of isolation. I remembered the forged documents. I remembered the withered, dying fern in the corner of my windowless room. I leaned into the microphone. "I do not have dementia, Lynette," I roared. The sheer volume and primal fury in my voice sent a tremor through the crystal chandeliers overhead. It blasted through the ballroom, stripping every lie she had ever told down to bare, exposed bone. "And I certainly did not drink your toxic peppermint tea loaded with heavy neurotoxins for the past month." Lynette recoiled as though I had struck her across the face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her a pale, hollow ghost of herself. The audience erupted into a chaotic wave of shocked murmurs and frantic whispers. Press cameras fired in rapid succession, capturing the exact moment the flawless illusion fractured into 1,000 pieces. Warren backed away, hands trembling his sharp corporate mind, failing to grasp how a dead man had managed to dig himself out of the grave. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket and produced the small silver flash drive Garrison had pressed into my hand in the bathroom. I held it high in the air, letting the stage spotlight catch its metallic surface, so every person in the room could see it clearly. "We are done with the fairy tales," I said, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a blade. "You wanted to celebrate Hargrove Tech tonight. You wanted to sell my legacy to the highest bidder. Let us give the investors exactly what they came for. Let us look at the real Hargrove Tech portfolio." I didn't need to hand the drive to an audiovisual technician. Garrison had already patched directly into the hotel's main projection system from his locked booth upstairs. I gave a single sharp nod toward the tinted glass window at the back of the hall. Instantly, the massive glowing 30-year anniversary logo vanished from the giant screen behind me. The display went pitch black for a fraction of a second, then roared back to life in blinding high-definition clarity. It showed no corporate milestones, no quarterly profit projections. Instead, it displayed pages upon pages of heavily redacted international bank statements, complex offshore routing numbers, and classified cartel communications magnified to 20 feet tall, impossible for anyone in the room to look away from. I pointed at the screen, letting my finger trace the intricate web of illicit wire transfers Warren had authorized using my forged signature. Thick red arrows linked the dummy corporations in South America directly to Hargrove Tech's operational accounts. The raw, unfiltered truth blazed in front of the entire room. The initial silence in the grand ballroom shattered, replaced by a crashing wave of overlapping voices. The wealthy corporate elite who had just moments ago been applauding my supposed downfall were now shouting in profound confusion and mounting horror. Men in tailored tuxedos pointed at the screen, recognizing the sheer scale of the financial crimes displayed before them. Women in evening gowns pressed their hands to their mouths and backed away from the stage as the dangerous reality of the situation closed in. But the most dramatic reaction came from the front row. The four cartel representatives, the dangerous men Warren had proudly paraded as European venture capitalists, abandoned their composed, sophisticated disguises entirely. The moment the offshore routing numbers lit up the giant screen, genuine panic distorted their faces. They understood immediately that their carefully insulated money laundering network had been completely exposed. They didn't wait for an explanation. They shoved their heavy chairs backward, sending crystal champagne flutes and elaborate floral arrangements crashing to the floor. They drove through the bewildered crowd with aggressive trained urgency heads down, moving toward the heavy brass exit doors at the back of the ballroom. They were abandoning Warren, completely leaving him to go down with the ship he had so arrogantly steered into a storm. I did not let the momentum slip for a single second. I gripped the podium edges and leaned hard into the live microphone. "You wanted a speech about the future of this family legacy," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising panic. "Let us hear the vision my brother and my wife had for my future." I gave Garrison another subtle nod. The giant screen divided in half, the financial documents holding the left side, while a pulsing audio waveform materialized on the right. A sharp crackle of static hissed through the state-of-the-art surround. Sound speakers followed, immediately by crystal-clear audio playback. It was the exact recording my hidden device had captured on my very first night back at the estate. Warren's arrogant, boastful voice filled the ballroom, rolling off the high gilded ceilings. "I finished the transfer an hour ago," his recorded voice declared with pride. "Every single trace of his liquid assets has been scrubbed, funneled through 3 different shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. That 70-year-old convict has absolutely nothing left to his name." The crowd gasped in collective horror. Then Lynette's cold, mocking laughter poured through the speakers, sounding far more sinister now that her angelic facade had been stripped away. "Good," her recorded voice answered with chilling cruelty. "Let him come home. What is he going to do? He is a disgraced, broke old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we will just toss him in some cheap rundown nursing home. We can claim his mind deteriorated in prison. No one will question us. We have the power of attorney." The malice in their own words hung heavily over the room, a definitive confession broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. The impact of that recording was absolutely devastating. Lynette, who had been standing rigidly near the edge of the stage, appeared to physically shrink as her own cruel words washed back over her. She understood that every prominent socialite, every wealthy investor, and every powerful journalist in the room was staring at her with undisguised, absolute disgust. The pristine, tragic narrative she had so carefully maintained for 12 long years disintegrated completely before her eyes. She let out a weak, agonizing wail entirely stripped of her usual theatrical composure. Her knees gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard, polished stage floor, her expensive silk evening gown pooling around her shaking legs. She raised her trembling hands and pressed them fiercely against her face, as though she could physically shut out the overwhelming shame and the crowd's condemning stares. She curled inward, a broken, pathetic figure, weeping openly on the floor, finally tasting a fraction of the deep, suffocating humiliation she had so willingly poured over me for more than a decade. Warren, however, refused to go down quietly. He was drenched in sweat, thick rivulets streaming down his flushed, frantic face. His gaze flew wildly across the chaotic ballroom, watching his wealthy buyers scatter as his meticulously built reputation crumbled to ash. He spotted a backup microphone sitting on a small table near the stage steps. He lunged for it, seizing the heavy metal stand with white-knuckled desperation. He clicked it on his breathing, ragged and labored. "It is a fake," Warren shrieked into the backup microphone, his voice fracturing under raw, uncontrollable desperation. Do not listen to him. The audio is a deep fake. He is a convicted felon trying to destroy a legitimate business deal. He jabbed a shaking finger in my direction, his chest heaving with every strained breath. He is out of his mind. He has completely lost it. And none of it matters anyway. What he shows you means nothing. He thrust his hand inside his tailored jacket and yanked out the thick stack of documents I had signed just minutes before. He waved the relinquishment contract frantically overhead, brandishing it like a shield against an unstoppable flood of ruin. He just surrendered every right he had at that podium. I have his signature in my hands right now. This company is legally mine, and I am closing this sale tonight. You cannot stop me from taking what is rightfully mine, Gerald. Warren stood there gasping, holding the relinquishment contract high above his head, clutching it like a man trying to outrun a tide he could never beat. His chest shuddered beneath his custom-tailored tuxedo. He was cornered by his own design, yet his towering ego flatly refused to let him fold. He gripped the backup microphone knuckles draining of color as he swept the grand ballroom for any ally. He found none. The corporate elite, who had fawned over him mere minutes ago, now regarded him with open horror and contempt. Even through the chaos, Warren fought to hold his grip on power. He leveled a trembling finger at me, face slick with perspiration. He is a convicted felon! Warren screamed, his voice shredding through the speakers. He forged those documents. He is trying to extort me because he is broke and bitter. It does not matter. This company is legally mine. I have the signed paperwork right here. I am finalizing the sale right now. I did not raise my voice. I did not so much as blink. I simply stood at the crystal podium and regarded my brother with a warm, chillingly composed smile. The sheer stillness of my expression made his wild ranting look all the more pathetic. I reached over and lightly tapped the microphone in front of me, making certain every ear in the room would catch my next words. Warren, I said, my tone almost gentle, nearly conversational. You have always been so consumed by the paperwork, but you really should have paid closer attention to who was sitting at your table. As for that contract you were clutching, you might want to take a good look at your buyers. Warren went rigid. His frantic eyes jumped from my face to the front row, searching for the 4 polished European venture capitalists who were supposed to be his salvation. Before Warren could process what I had just said, a thunderous crash tore through the back of the grand ballroom. The heavy gilded brass doors were kicked open with violent force, slamming into the marble walls and sending a shockwave through the room. The refined, carefully curated atmosphere of the corporate gala was instantly shattered. Dozens of heavily armed tactical agents poured in. They wore dark gear bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission across their vests. The synchronized weight of their movement seemed to shake the very floor beneath us. Federal agents, nobody move, a commanding voice boomed through a megaphone. Stay where you are and keep your hands where we can see them. The assembled guests shrieked and pressed themselves against the flower-draped walls, frozen in terror as the federal tactical units swept the room. But the true shock came from the very front row. The 4 men in expensive Italian suits, the men Warren had proudly presented as distinguished European investors, did not bolt for the exits. Instead, they moved with lethal, synchronized precision. They reached inside their tailored jackets and drew heavy, dark firearms simultaneously. They yanked thick metal badges from their breast pockets and let them hang on chains around their necks. They were not cartel emissaries. They were deep-cover federal agents. The lead undercover agent, a tall, imposing figure with razor-sharp eyes, vaulted over the VIP table and advanced directly toward the stage stairs. His weapon was angled at the floor, but every inch of his bearing radiated undeniable authority. Warren stumbled backward, completely undone by the nightmare unfolding around him. The relinquishment contract slipped in his sweat-soaked grip. He looked at the armed agents, then at Lynette weeping on the floor, and finally back at me. His sharp, calculating mind was in total freefall. He could not fathom how his airtight, meticulously insulated criminal empire was being torn apart by the federal government in the middle of his own victory celebration. I stepped away from the crystal podium and crossed the stage slowly until I was standing mere inches from my trembling brother. I looked down at him and let all 12 years of suppressed fury and righteous vengeance settle into my steady, unflinching gaze. The warmth drained from my face, replaced by a cold, precise intensity that made him physically recoil. Did you really think I spent 12 years in a concrete cell doing absolutely nothing? Warren, I asked, my voice low, but carrying a weight that filled every corner of that room. Did you believe I spent 4,000 days staring at a wall while you stole my life and poisoned my tea? You badly underestimated my patience. For the past 4 years, I was not simply a disgraced convict. I was a classified confidential informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Warren let out a strangled, breathless gasp. His eyes went wide to the point of tearing. He shook his head feebly, unable to string together a single coherent word. We knew everything about your massive cartel laundering operation. I pressed on, ensuring he grasped the full scope of his defeat. We traced every offshore account, every shell corporation, and every illicit wire transfer executed under my forged signature. But the federal prosecutors had a serious problem. Because you were so extraordinarily careful about hiding behind my name, they could not legally prove beyond any doubt that you alone were the architect of the criminal enterprise. They needed you to step out from my shadow. They needed you to willingly and publicly claim total undeniable ownership of the contaminated assets. We simply needed you to formally declare sole ownership of those illicit holdings to cut through the corporate shielding laws. That thick stack of papers you are clutching, I whispered, stepping back, is not your ticket to freedom. It is your signed, verified confession. The tall undercover agent climbed the short flight of stairs and walked with purpose onto the stage. He was Agent Corbin, the lead financial investigator who had worked alongside me in the shadows for 4 grueling years. He holstered his weapon and stepped directly in front of my brother. Warren was shaking so severely his knees looked ready to give way. His imperious posture had utterly collapsed, leaving nothing behind but a terrified, hollow shell of a man. Agent Corbin reached out and took the signed relinquishment contract cleanly from Warren's weak, trembling hands. He moved through the pages, his eyes tracking the precisely executed signatures I had provided just minutes before. He snapped the folio shut with a sharp, definitive crack that rang out across the quiet stage. He fixed Warren with an expression of pure professional contempt. "Thank you for documenting your sole liability for the cartel debt, Warren," Agent Corbin said, coldly drawing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You have just made our most difficult job remarkably easy to finish tonight. It is entirely over for you. The criminal syndicate you spent 12 years constructing is going to be dismantled piece by careful piece, and you will be spending the remainder of your miserable life inside a federal prison cell." Those words crashed into Warren with devastating force. He stood completely motionless on the brightly lit stage, staring at the cold handcuffs dangling from the agent's hands. He began to hyperventilate, pulling in short, shallow gasps as the walls of his criminal empire caved in around him. The polished corporate titan was gone entirely. In his place stood a desperate, cornered animal, thrashing against a trap with no exit. He shook his head so violently that sweat flew from his brow and spattered against the crystal podium. His terrified eyes shot past Agent Corbin and locked onto the undercover cartel representatives standing at the foot of the stage stairs. "Wait!" Warren screamed, his voice pitching upward into a shrill wail of sheer panic. "You do not understand. We can still fix this. The company still holds all the original patents. We still have the foundational source code that drives the entire global infrastructure." He stumbled forward, hands raised in a pathetic, pleading gesture toward the men he believed were his partners. "I will sell the patents first thing tomorrow morning. I can liquidate the intellectual property." Warren begged, his words tumbling over one another in frantic desperation. "I can make you completely whole. I still own the tech. I still control the most valuable software algorithm in this entire industry. We can settle the full debt. You just have to give me 24 hours to lock in the buyers." I stood perfectly still, watching my brother humiliate himself before the federal agents and the last of the fleeing corporate elite. I let him burn through every last scrap of false hope. When his frantic pleading dissolved into breathless panting, I took one slow, deliberate step forward. I moved past Agent Corbin, positioning myself squarely between the federal authorities and the man who shared my blood. Warren looked at me, his eyes wide and completely feral, silently begging for a lifeline he had never earned. I reached into the breast pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket. My fingers moved past the silver fountain pen and closed around a secondary legal document I had carried with me all evening. I drew out a crisp sheet of ivory parchment, unfolding it with agonizing deliberateness beneath the harsh glare of the spotlight. "No, Warren," I said, my voice dropping to a low resonant register that commanded total silence from every corner of the ballroom. "No, you absolutely do not." Warren stared at the folded document, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically between my composed face and the paper in my hands. He swallowed hard, his throat working against his tight collar. "What is that?" He croaked, every trace of false bravado completely gone from his trembling voice. "This is the ultimate price of underestimating your older brother," I replied evenly. 13 years ago, long before federal investigators ever descended on our corporate offices, long before you forged my digital signature and pinned your early crimes on me, I noticed several troubling irregularities in our accounting ledgers. I could not pinpoint exactly what you were plotting at the time, but instinct told me to protect the foundational architecture of everything I had built. I refused to leave my greatest creation exposed to anyone, not even my own family. So I took an immediate classified precaution. I stepped closer, narrowing the distance between us until I could see tiny reflections of my own face swimming in his panicked eyes. I quietly transferred the exclusive copyright to our core algorithm and every foundational software patent out of Hargrove Tech. I reassigned full ownership to a completely anonymous holding company registered under the name Aegis Systems. I am the sole owner of that holding company, and I always have been. Warren's jaw fell open. He shook his head in rapid, disbelieving movements, unable to absorb the magnitude of the corporate checkmate I had just laid before him. "That is completely impossible." He stammered, his voice barely a hollow rasp. "Hargrove Tech has been running that software every single day for the past 12 years. We built the entire cartel laundering network on top of that specific algorithmic infrastructure. If we did not own it, how were we using it?" "They need it burst." "Because you were renting it," I said, delivering each word with cold surgical precision. "Hargrove Tech never actually owned the proprietary software that made the company worth anything. The company has been licensing that software on a highly restrictive lease from Aegis Systems, a lease that expressly prohibited any involvement in illicit financial activity. And because you violated those terms by washing millions of dollars in dirty cartel money through the platform, I exercised my legal right as the sole owner of Aegis Systems. I formally terminated that licensing lease yesterday morning." The silence that fell over the ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. Warren swayed on his feet, the color draining from his face until his skin looked like pale ash. The full, horrifying architecture of his situation was finally breaking through the thick wall of his denial. He was beginning to grasp the scope of the trap I had spent 4 years constructing alongside the federal authorities. I stepped directly into Warren's face, towering over his shaking frame, making certain he felt every ounce of the weight bearing down on him. "You did not steal a $50 million tech company 12 years ago." I stated, my voice ringing with ruthless finality. "You stole a completely hollow corporate shell. You spent a decade inflating that shell with over $100 million in toxic illicit cartel debt. You thought you were the mastermind. You thought you were using my legacy to erect an untouchable criminal empire, but all you were really doing was packing explosives around your own feet." I pointed down at the signed relinquishment contract that Agent Corbin was holding. "And the greatest tragedy of your greedy life is that you were so frantic to secure your stolen wealth tonight, so terrified I might try to claim even a sliver of what you took, that you forced me to sign away my rights. You demanded that I publicly sever myself from Hargrove Tech in front of witnesses, leaving you as the sole owner of the corporate entity. You just voluntarily put your name on a legally binding document, making yourself personally liable for every single penny of that $100 million in cartel debt." Warren let out a strangled sound that was half sob, half scream. His legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the stage, dropping hard onto his knees. He raised his trembling hands to his face, pulling violently at his own hair as his mind splintered under the weight of what he now understood. He was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, and he owed $100 million to the most dangerous men alive. He had no leverage. He had no assets. He had no way out. The magnificent empire he believed he had taken from me was nothing more than a brilliantly engineered toxic mirage. I stood over his weeping, broken body and felt a profound wave of vindication move through me, as I watched his entire world finally collapse to dust. The crushing certainty of his destruction settled over Warren like a suffocating shroud. He remained on his knees, his tailored tuxedo plastered to his sweat-soaked frame. There was no escaping it. He was not simply losing the $50 million company he had stolen from me. He was headed to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of his natural life. He had just signed a legally binding document placing himself personally on the hook for $100 million in illicit debt to an international cartel ruthless killers who would chase him to the ends of the earth. He had painted a massive permanent target directly onto his own back. I watched his chest heave as he fought to pull air into his panicking lungs. His calculating mind had completely short-circuited. His bloodshot eyes found me standing above him, perfectly calm posture, straight and unyielding. I did not offer him a single ounce of mercy. I simply watched him drown in the same ocean of despair he had so ruthlessly thrown me into 12 years before. Then the panic inside Warren shifted into something else entirely. The terror in his eyes hardened into blind, feral rage. He understood that every agonizing consequence now bearing down on him existed because of my quiet, patient orchestration. With a guttural, animalistic roar torn from the depths of his chest, Warren surged upward. He threw his full body weight toward me, desperate to close his hands around my throat. He did not care about the flashing cameras or the armed tactical units surrounding the stage. He wanted only to destroy the man who had outmaneuvered him, but he never came close to laying a finger on me. Before I could even adjust my stance, two heavily armored federal agents cut off his path with brutal efficiency. One drove his shoulder squarely into Warren's chest, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward. The second snatched his flailing arm and wrenched it sharply behind his back. Warren crashed hard against the polished wooden floor of the stage, the impact blasting the air from his lungs with a loud, wretched gasp. The agents did not pause. They pressed their knees into his back, pinning him firmly to the ground. Warren thrashed and screamed, spitting incoherent curses and violent threats. His face twisted into a mask of pure madness. Steel handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists with a sharp metallic snap. He was completely immobilized, face pressed humiliatingly against the floor, panting and spitting as the cold reality of his confinement locked into place. As the agents hauled my screaming brother toward the exit, a sudden movement at the edge of the stage caught my eye. Lynette had been cowering there, her expensive silk gown tangled around her trembling legs. The poised, polished socialite who had coldly poured poison into my tea just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In her place cowered a terrified, sniveling coward. Watching her partner in crime dragged away in chains, she understood that whatever shield had protected her had completely dissolved. The federal authorities were not about to let her stroll out of that room. She was an active co-conspirator, a perjurer, and an attempted murderer. Her glamorous stolen life was finished. Lynette scrambled forward on her hands and knees, heedless of the sharp pain, as bare skin scraped against the hard wooden stage. She clawed her way across the floor until she reached my feet. She threw her arms out and seized the fabric of my black tuxedo pants in a fierce, desperate grip. Her makeup was completely destroyed, trailing down her pale cheeks in dark, smeared streaks. She stared up at me, eyes wide with a pathetic, manufactured anguish. She squeezed my leg tightly, driving her manicured nails into the fabric, as though I were a piece of wreckage in a churning, merciless sea. "Gerald, please," Lynette wailed, her voice shrill and raw, above the ambient noise still lingering in the room. "You have to hear me out. He made me do it. Warren forced me to lie in court. He threatened to ruin me if I did not memorize that script and testify against you. He preyed on me when I was vulnerable and terrified. I never wanted to harm you. I was just trying to survive what he was doing to me. Please, Gerald, you know the woman I truly am. I never stopped caring about you. I still love you." The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was reaching for the very same manipulative arsenal she had used to destroy my life 12 years before. She genuinely believed she could summon a few tears, play the helpless, coerced victim, and convince me to shield her from the federal prosecutors. She thought my heart was still pliable enough to forgive her ultimate betrayal. I did not step away from her. I simply stood perfectly still and looked down at her tear-streaked face with absolute unyielding contempt. I felt no sorrow for the woman weeping at my feet. I felt no lingering pull from the memories we had once shared. She was nothing more than a poisonous parasite who had fed on my success and conspired to rot my mind from the inside out. I reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket. My fingers moved past the silver fountain pen and wrapped around a small cylindrical glass object. I drew my hand out slowly, revealing a tiny glass vial sealed with a black rubber stopper. Inside, resting against the transparent walls, was a fine, pale yellow powder. It was the exact neurotoxic compound she had been carefully crushing and dissolving into my nightly peppermint tea. I had recovered the remainder of her supply earlier that afternoon, while she was occupied having her hair done for the gala. I held the small vial up to the bright overhead spotlight, making certain she could see precisely what it was. The instant Lynette recognized the container, her desperate sobbing cut off completely. Her eyes stretched wide in paralyzing terror. Her mouth fell open, but no sound escaped. She understood that I knew everything: the forged documents, the offshore accounts, the slow and deliberate campaign to murder my cognitive function. I opened my fingers and let the vial fall. It dropped cleanly through the air and landed in the center of her lap, coming to rest against the expensive silk of her designer evening gown. "Tell it to the judge, Lynette," I said, my voice flat, cold, and stripped of any human warmth. "Enjoy the food in federal prison." I stepped back sharply, pulling my pant leg entirely free of her grasping hands. Two female federal agents moved in, immediately seizing Lynette by her bare arms and hauling her roughly upright. She began to shriek a high, piercing sound of pure terror and absolute defeat. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name again and again, as the agents dragged her from the stage and out of the grand ballroom, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, absolute triumph of my reclaimed life. The grand ballroom, once a glittering monument to my brother's stolen victory, was now a churning federal crime scene. The press cameras were quickly corralled by tactical units, though more than enough sensational footage had already been captured to dominate the global news cycle for months ahead. I stood near the crystal podium, watching the dramatic aftermath play out with a profound, settled tranquility. Agent Corbin approached me, his heavy tactical boots crunching across broken glass and scattered champagne flutes littering the floor. He pulled off his protective helmet and extended a firm, deeply respectful hand. I took it, feeling the solid grip of a man who understood exactly what we had both sacrificed to reach this moment. He looked me directly in the eyes and spoke the words I had spent 4,000 agonizing days waiting to hear. "The paperwork has been fully processed by the Department of Justice." Agent Corbin said, his voice low, but carrying unmistakable weight through the surrounding noise. "Your exoneration is officially complete, Gerald. The federal judge signed the executive order this morning. Every fraudulent charge has been entirely expunged from your record. You are no longer a convicted felon. You are a free man with a completely clean slate." I closed my eyes and let the immense gravity of those words wash over my weary soul. The invisible, suffocating chains that had bound me for 12 years shattered into dust. I drew a long, steadying breath and opened my eyes to find Garrison walking purposefully onto the brightly lit stage. My fiercely loyal attorney no longer looked like the battered, defeated paralegal Warren had tried so hard to grind into nothing. He stood tall, radiating the sharp, brilliant legal mind that my brother had spent years trying to destroy. Garrison reached into his jacket pocket and produced a familiar, gleaming object, my father's vintage gold timepiece. He had personally retrieved it from Warren's wrist during the arrest. Garrison held it out to me, a silent and powerful testament to everything we had fought for together. I took the watch, feeling its cool, solid weight settle into my palm. It was not simply an expensive piece of jewelry. It was the physical embodiment of my family's true legacy, finally untainted, finally freed from my brother's treacherous, consuming greed. I slowly fastened the worn leather band around my wrist and buckled it into place. The familiar weight of it against my skin felt exactly like the return of my own soul. I turned my attention to the remaining guests in the ballroom. The shell-shocked board members of Hargrove Tech were huddled near the overturned VIP tables, watching me with a potent mixture of deep guilt and paralyzed dread. They knew they had abandoned me, and they knew I now held their professional fates entirely in my hands. I stepped to the microphone one final time. My voice carried clearly across the silent, heavily guarded room, commanding complete attention. "Hargrove Tech is officially dead," I announced, delivering the verdict without a trace of hesitation or regret. "The company you all knew and profited from was nothing more than a corrupted shell. and it will be fully liquidated by the federal government tomorrow morning to satisfy the illicit debts my brother accumulated. But the foundational technology, the proprietary algorithms, and the true untainted vision behind this empire belong exclusively to Aegis Systems. I paused deliberately, letting my gaze move across the row of terrified executives who had once turned their backs on me. Aegis Systems launches tomorrow morning, I continued evenly. We will operate with a clean slate and a culture of absolute unwavering integrity. We are actively hiring, but we will be extraordinarily selective about who we bring into our new home. And I am proud to announce that Garrison Pendleton will be stepping in immediately as my Chief Operating Officer. Garrison stood tall beside me, nodding firmly to the captivated room, officially reclaiming his rightful place at the pinnacle of the corporate world. I stepped down from the stage, leaving the smoldering ruins of my brother's criminal empire behind me. I walked across the polished marble floor toward the heavy brass exit doors. I did not lean on an aluminum walking cane. I did not shuffle or slump. I walked with the powerful, unyielding stride of a man who had just conquered his own darkest demons. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the crisp Richmond night air. The city lights blazed against the dark sky, welcoming me back to the world of the living. Fast forward exactly 6 months. I stood quietly beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly renovated Richmond penthouse office, gazing out over the sprawling city skyline. The federal trials had concluded swiftly and without mercy. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence we had gathered, combined with my own detailed testimony, both Warren and Lynette were found guilty on multiple severe counts of corporate fraud, international money laundering, and gross perjury. I attended their final sentencing hearing, for one reason alone, to watch the judge bring the gavel down. Warren looked utterly destroyed, that imperious bearing replaced by a permanent trembling hunch, as the reality landed that he would never again pull on a tailored suit. Lynette sobbed hysterically in the courtroom, pleading with the judge for a mercy she had never once extended to me. They were both sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole whatsoever. They would live out their remaining days in concrete cages, enduring the precise nightmare they had so deliberately engineered for me. The international cartel assets they had managed were systematically seized and dismantled by coordinated federal task forces. Their illicit empire was scrubbed from existence, leaving them with nothing but the crushing weight of their own colossal regrets. The millions they had stolen were gone. They discovered the hardest way imaginable, that a life constructed on lies guarantees only a spectacular, inevitable collapse when the foundation finally gives way. Meanwhile, Aegis Systems had officially launched its revolutionary new logistics software to massive, unprecedented global acclaim. The clean, unburdened company was flourishing well beyond anything I had dared to imagine. Without the toxic drag of Warren's criminal enterprises slowing us down, our proprietary algorithms reshaped supply chains across the entire industry worldwide. Within a matter of months, that extraordinary launch effectively tripled my original net worth. The market recognized our integrity, and our momentum was entirely unstoppable. The heavy oak doors of my office swung open with a soft click. Garrison walked in looking sharp and supremely confident in his new role as my Chief Operating Officer. He carried 2 heavy crystal glasses and a sealed bottle of rare 20-year-old scotch. He crossed to the small wet bar near my desk, uncorked the dark bottle, and poured the rich amber liquid. He handed a glass directly to me. A proud and knowing smile settled comfortably on his face. We stood together in the quiet, refined elegance of the penthouse and raised our glasses in a silent, deeply meaningful toast to our unwavering patience, to our meticulous strategy, and to the absolute, undeniable certainty of karma. I took a slow sip of the smooth scotch, feeling its warmth spread through my chest like something long overdue. The 12 agonizing years I lost inside that concrete cell could never be given back to me, but they were not wasted. They had forged me into a precise, razor-sharp instrument entirely capable of cutting the toxic, greedy cancer out of my life. After a decade spent living in the darkest shadows, I was finally completely free. I turned away from the window and walked slowly to my expansive custom-built desk. The smooth, polished surface was clear, save for a few neatly arranged legal files sitting squarely in the center. Those thick folders held the final definitive chapters of the nightmare my family had imposed on me. I set my hand flat against the cool leather portfolio, and felt a profound sense of closure move through my fingertips. The storm had passed at last, leaving behind a clear, unburdened horizon. The federal trials had wrapped up swiftly and without a shred of mercy. The prosecution's case was entirely airtight, built on the overwhelming digital evidence we had assembled and anchored by my own detailed first-hand testimony. Warren and Lynette had tried desperately to turn on each other in the courtroom, pointing trembling fingers and hurling vicious accusations in a pathetic bid to save themselves. The federal judge saw straight through every cowardly manipulation. They were found guilty on multiple severe counts of corporate fraud, international money laundering, and gross perjury. I was there in that courtroom when the gavel struck the sounding block and sealed their fate. Warren looked completely shattered, his polished, commanding posture gone forever, replaced by a defeated slouch as it sank in that he would never again stand at the head of a boardroom. Lynette wept hysterically, face buried in her shackled hands, begging for a leniency she had never once considered when she coolly set about orchestrating my destruction. 25 years, maximum security, no possibility of early parole. They would spend what remained of their lives behind the same kind of concrete walls they had so willingly built around mine. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden light across the Richmond skyline, flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office. It was a view I had replayed in my mind during the bleakest stretches of that cramped federal cell, and here it was, real mine. The office carried the scent of rich mahogany and fresh espresso, a world removed from the cold, sterile air I had breathed for 12 long years. I could still hear the harsh metallic clang of iron doors sealing shut behind me. Now those doors were open forever. I drew a slow, deep breath and let the weight of that freedom fill my lungs entirely. The journey from disgraced, forgotten convict to the undisputed owner of a thriving technology empire had been nothing short of extraordinary, but it was no accident of fortune. It was the product of patience held far beyond what most men could bear, of strategy executed with absolute precision, and of a refusal to let justice go unpursued. I raised my glass once more and looked out over the city. The skyline blazed under the morning light, indifferent and magnificent, the same as it had always been. But I wasn't the same man who had been taken from it. I was something the man who took everything from me never anticipated, someone who had all the time in the world to wait, to plan, and to win. If you have stayed with me this far, then you already know this was never just a story about a company or a courtroom or a contract signed under a spotlight. It was about what a person becomes when everything is stripped away and they choose in the silence of a concrete cell not to break. 12 years, that is what it cost. 12 years of watching the world move on without me, of being written off as a disgrace by the very people who owed me their loyalty. I will not pretend that did not leave marks. It did. But I believe God does not waste suffering. Every one of those days sharpened something in me that comfort never could have touched. I came out the other side, not just restored, but carrying a clarity that Warren and Lynette, for all their scheming, never possessed for a single moment of their lives. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. Do not let urgency be used as a weapon against you. The person rushing you to sign, to decide to surrender, they are afraid of what you will discover if you slow down. Patience is not weakness. It is the most disciplined form of strength a person can carry, especially when everyone around you has already counted you out. Protect what you build. The thing your name is on the vision, only you fully understand. Guard it before anyone else knows. It needs guarding. And if someone tries to rewrite your story, remember the truth does not disappear just because it has been buried. It waits. These father stories, the ones about men who were dismissed, discarded, and underestimated, matter because they remind us that a life is not over until it is over. And sometimes the final chapter is the most powerful one ever written. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment and tell me what you took from it. And if you know someone who is carrying a heavy load right now, who needs to be reminded that their patience has a purpose, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. Subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss what comes next. And thank you truly for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself.